And now, a passage from The English Settlers in Colonial Pennsylvania by Wayland Fuller Dunaway. Though the English were the dominant racial element in colonial Pennsylvania, no one has hitherto been at pains to tell the story of this race as such in the settlement of the province. A large number of monographs and articles have been written to describe the migrations, settlements, and achievements of other elements of the population, such as the Germans, the Scotch-Irish, the Welsh, and the Swedes. But the English have been strangely neglected. It would appear that the English of Pennsylvania take themselves for granted, and hence have not felt called upon to write up their own history. Again, they have not been so race-conscious and clannish as some others have been, but rather have been content to dispense with the hyphen and to become thoroughly Americanized in thought and feeling. Even so, in view of the considerable body of literature describing the other original elements of the population and the almost total lack of such literature devoted specifically to the English, it would seem to be in order to give at least a brief survey of the English settlements in the provincial era. For the purposes of this article, the colonial period will be construed as extending to 1790, partly because it is a convenient stopping place, and partly because by doing so, it is possible to incorporate some of the data gleaned from the first census. No attempt is here made to give an extended treatment of the subject, but merely to call attention to some of its salient features. It may be further stated that the term English is used by the writer to designate race rather than nationality, and therefore includes all settlers of English blood, regardless of whether they emigrated to Pennsylvania directly from the mother country or had settled previously in other colonies. The Dutch were the first Europeans to gain lodgment on the banks of the Delaware and were in undisputed control until 1638, when the Swedes began the settlement of the colony of New Sweden. Soon outnumbering the Dutch, the Swedes established a flourishing community and were making considerable headway when they were conquered by a Dutch expedition from New Amsterdam in 1655. Though a minority of the population, the Dutch remained thereafter in control until, in their turn, they were conquered in 1664 by the English, who established the Duke's laws on the Delaware. Henceforth, interest centers chiefly in the English throughout this region, as they were the real founders of Pennsylvania and eventually absorbed both the Dutch and Swedes who had preceded them. The Delaware region, regarded as an appendix of the government of New York, remained under the rule of the Duke of York until Penn assumed control under his charter. People of English stock had appeared in the Delaware Territory at an early period. In 1639, New Haven had become interested in founding a colony in the vicinity of the present town of Salem, New Jersey, and in 1640 had sent out about 60 colonists to settle there. These were expelled by the Swedes and Dutch, however, and the English made no further attempt to colonize the east bank of the river until after the conquest of the Dutch in 1664. Under the Duke's rule, Dutch and Swedish immigration practically ceased along the Delaware, but the English began coming in increasing numbers. By 1670, civil government was well established, with Upland as the capital, and in the ensuing decade, a number of English immigrants affected settlements on the west side of the river, especially in the vicinity of the falls. Considerable land was taken up within the bounds of Pennsylvania by English settlers between 1674 and 1681, while Governor Edmund Andros ruled New York as the Duke's representative. According to Proud, the first most considerable settlement in Pennsylvania proper is said to have been near the lower falls of the River Delaware in Bucks County, some of the inhabitants having settled there by virtue of patents from Sir Edmund Andros, governor of New York. The falls of the Delaware became the center of a little English colony several years before Penn's arrival. Among these early settlers were William Yardley, James Harrison, Phineas Pemberton, William Biles, William Dark, Lionel Britton, William Beeks, and others. And soon afterwards, there and near Neshaminy Creek, Richard Howe, Henry Baker, Nicholas Walna, John Otter, Robert Hall, and in Wrightstown, John Chapman and James Ratcliffe. Among those who received grants of land in this vicinity from Governor Andros in 1678 to 80 were Thomas Fairman for 200 acres, William Clark for 309 acres, John Ackerman 309 acres, Gilbert Wheeler 205 acres, William Biles 309 acres, Samuel Cycle 218 acres, Richard Ridgway 218 acres, Robert Lucas 145 acres, and John Wood 478 acres. These tracts adjoined each other and bordered on the Delaware. Samuel Bliss owned a large tract which included the present site of Bristol. Another prominent pioneer in this region was William Warner, a large landowner and a man of consequence who became a member of the First Assembly in Pennsylvania. When West New Jersey came into the possession of William Penn and other Quaker proprietors, colonists of that faith soon began to arrive, settling Salem in 1675 and Burlington in 1677. It is estimated that by the close of 1678, at least 800 immigrants, mostly English Quakers, had settled in West Jersey. Some of these located in Salem and vicinity, but Burlington became the Quaker headquarters and chief center of influence. As a byproduct of this invasion of West Jersey by English Quakers, a respectable number of the newcomers crossed over to the west side of the Delaware and added to the slowly growing number of the English within the bounds of Pennsylvania. This was the source of the Quaker settlements in the province before the arrival of Penn, and they located chiefly at the falls of the Delaware, Shakamaxon, Upland, and Marcus Hook, or in the vicinity of these places. Prior to the coming of Penn, the following Quaker heads of families had settled in or around Upland and Marcus Hook: Robert Wade, Roger Pedrick, Morgan Druitt, William Woodmanson, Michael Izard, Thomas Revell, Henry Hastings, William Oxley, James Brown, Henry Reynolds, and Thomas Nossiter. It is estimated that about 1,400 Quakers, mostly English, emigrated to New Jersey and Pennsylvania before Penn's arrival, though the majority of these settled in West Jersey. Some, however, settled lower down the Delaware in and around Newcastle and Horkhills. In 1681, a yearly meeting was established at Burlington with jurisdiction over all the Quakers within the bounds of the present states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Prominent among this group of early English Quakers was Robert Wade, who settled at Upland, bought 650 acres of land, and built the famous Essex House, at which was held in 1675 the first meeting of Quakers on Pennsylvania soil. Other early English settlers in the vicinity of Upland were John Test, Walter Wharton, Richard Noble, and Richard Bovington. Thus, it appears that before the founding of Pennsylvania proper under Penn's charter, there was already, within the present bounds of the Commonwealth, an advance guard of English settlers, deriving their land titles from Governor Edmund Andros, the Duke's representative on the Delaware. These settlers were mostly Quakers and were established principally at the falls of the Delaware, Shakamaxon, Upland, and Marcus Hook and vicinity. There were doubtless a few other English settlers between these points, just as there were others at Newcastle and vicinity, though it is difficult to trace them. They were not numerous and were greatly outnumbered by the Swedes above Upland and by the Dutch below that point. Like the Dutch and Swedes, they were not in the line of the real beginning of Pennsylvania, which was the work of William Penn, founder of the Quaker Commonwealth, under the charter granted him by the king in 1681. Nevertheless, they were the pioneer English settlers in Pennsylvania and are entitled to recognition as such. The sources of English emigration into Pennsylvania may be described as direct and indirect, the former term applying to those who came directly from England, and the latter to those who came from the British colonies. If the racial strain was English, we are concerned with them, whether they came directly or indirectly from the mother country. William Penn received his charter March 4th, 1681, and in the summer of that year sent over his cousin, William Markham, to represent him as deputy governor until he himself should arrive. Accompanying Markham, who probably sailed on the John and Sarah, were 3 commissioners appointed by Penn to confer with the Indians respecting their lands and to cultivate with them friendly relations. The first group of English emigrants who sailed directly for Pennsylvania left England in the summer of 1681 in 3 ships, the John and Sarah, the Amity, and the Bristol Factor, the 2 former sailing from London and the latter from Bristol. The John and Sarah was the first to arrive, and her passengers were called the First Landers by those coming later. Among these were Nathaniel Allen, John Otter, and Edmund Lovett, who settled in Bucks County along the Delaware. The Bristol Factor arrived at Upland December 11th, 1681, where the passengers, seeing some houses, went on shore at Robert Wade's Landing near the lower side of Chester Creek, and the river having froze up that night, the passengers remained there all winter. The Amity was blown off the coast to the West Indies and did not land her passengers in Pennsylvania until the following spring. Penn sailed from England in August 1682 on board the ship Welcome, accompanied by about 100 passengers, of whom about 30 died on the voyage. These immigrants were mostly English Quakers, the majority of whom came from Sussex, Penn's place of residence. After a voyage of about 7 weeks, the Welcome arrived at Newcastle, October 27th, 1682. The population along the Delaware numbered probably 2,000 at the time of Penn's arrival. Of these, about 1,000 were located on the Jersey side of the river and consisted principally of English Quakers, though some Swedes and other nationalities were represented. On the west side of the river, the population likewise numbered about 1,000, and consisted of Swedes, Dutch, Finns, English, and a few Germans, with the Swedes largely in the majority. Of those on the west side of the Delaware, about 500 were in the present state of Delaware, and about as many more in the present state of Pennsylvania. Within the borders of Pennsylvania, the English at that time probably did not exceed 100 in number. Penn thus found a cosmopolitan population in his new domain, though these early settlers were later to lose all trace of their national identity by being merged with the English. Even the lower counties, at first strongly Dutch, Swedish, and Finn, were to become English as time passed, and the increasing English population throughout that region absorbed the original racial elements. The great majority of English settlers in Pennsylvania came directly from the mother country. Following Penn's arrival there was a large and steady stream of English emigrants sailing chiefly from London and Bristol as ports of embarkation. Though other nationalities were present from the beginning and continued to come, nevertheless, the English Quakers were the dominant element in the founding of Pennsylvania. In 1682 and the 2 succeeding years, about 50 ships arrived with immigrants to Pennsylvania. These came from London, Bristol, Ireland, Cheshire, Lancashire, Holland, and Germany. But the large majority of them were English Quakers. According to Proud, these settlers amounted to such a large number that the parts near Delaware were peopled in a very rapid manner, even from about the Falls of Trenton down to Chester, near 50 miles on the river. Besides the settlements in the lower counties, which at the same time were very considerable, for the first settlements, for the most part, were made nigh the river, according to the different shares of land, which were respectively allotted for each settler. After the colony was fairly started under Penn, the Welsh came over in large numbers, and for a time rivaled the English. But the Welsh immigration practically ceased after 1700, while the English continued a steady stream throughout the whole colonial period. But few of the English coming after 1700 were Quakers, however, but rather Church of England men and Baptists. Nevertheless, the Quaker element predominated and gave direction to the affairs of the colony for many years. After about 1701, the Quaker population increased by a high birth rate rather than by immigration. Thus it appears that in the first generation after Penn's coming, the great body of English settlers came to Pennsylvania directly from the mother country, and being greatly in the majority founded Pennsylvania as an English community, predominantly Quaker. Though the stream of English immigration continued steadily throughout the entire provincial period, it was less pronounced after 1720 than it had been previously, while after 1730 it was far exceeded by the influx of Germans and Scotch-Irish. During the Revolution and the period of the Confederation, however, the German and Scotch-Irish immigration declined rapidly, whereas that from England again became much the strongest tide until 1790, and for many years thereafter. Though the large majority of immigrants of English stock came to Pennsylvania directly from England, especially in the early years of the colony, many also came from the neighboring British colonies on the mainland, and some from the British West Indies. This latter group was more important than has ordinarily been supposed, and embraced some of the most eminent Pennsylvanians of the colonial period. Certain of these immigrants settled as isolated communities far in the interior of the province, and their existence has generally been ignored in estimating the English population of the colony, which it has been customary to lump together as the community in and around Philadelphia. It might also be noted, incidentally, that quite a respectable number of immigrants of English blood, known as the English-Irish, came from Ireland to Pennsylvania and further swelled the English population of the province. These considerations might well lead to a revision of the customary estimates as to the relative numerical strength of the three main elements of the population of colonial Pennsylvania: the English, the German, and the Scotch-Irish, and to dispel some of the illusions that appear to have gathered around this subject. Pennsylvania proved to be an attractive colony, not only to emigrants from Europe, but to the inhabitants of the British colonies in the New World as well. And inasmuch as these colonies were inhabited chiefly by people of English stock, those of them who came to Pennsylvania were nearly all English in ancestry and traditions. Some of these were attracted to Pennsylvania because it offered a greater degree of religious liberty than was to be found elsewhere in America, except in Rhode Island. Others because of its vast stretches of fertile land awaiting occupancy. And others because as time went on, Philadelphia became the metropolis of America and presented all the attractions of a city, at once the largest, handsomest, wealthiest, and most cultured to be found in the land. This position it had attained by 1750 and continued to maintain with increasing prestige, not only throughout the later colonial era, but well into the national period. People of English antecedents and habits found in Philadelphia a congenial society, together with professional and commercial opportunities beyond those afforded elsewhere in America, and consequently were attracted thither. Apart from these considerations, there were special causes inducing immigration from Connecticut and to a certain extent from Virginia, growing out of the boundary claims of these two provinces, and the great majority of this class of immigrants were of English stock. Of the English settlers coming to Pennsylvania from other British colonies, by far the largest number came from New England, especially from Connecticut. In 1684, Reverend Thomas Dungan of Rhode Island came with his family to the vicinity of Bristol and Bucks County, gathered a Baptist congregation composed of English and Welsh, and organized a Baptist church, which held together until 1702. Benjamin Franklin came to Philadelphia from Boston and was followed by quite a number of other New Englanders, among whom was Jared Ingersoll of Connecticut. Practically all the New Englanders of the colonial period were of English stock, and the great body of those emigrating to Pennsylvania in this era came in connection with the attempt of Connecticut to establish her claim to northern Pennsylvania through the settlement of Wyoming and the extension of the jurisdiction of Connecticut throughout that region. However slight the merits of this claim might be, it was the occasion of introducing into Pennsylvania, in a remote and isolated section of the province, a considerable number of Connecticut people of English stock. This movement resulted not only in swelling the English element of the population of Pennsylvania in colonial times, but had important and lasting effects in peopling the northern tier of counties with settlers from the same source at a later date. In 1762, about 200 immigrants from Connecticut arrived in the Wyoming Valley, now embraced in Luzerne County, and settled there under the authority of the Susquehanna Company. In January 1774, Connecticut passed an act erecting all the territory within her charter limits, from the river Delaware to a line 15 miles west of the Susquehanna, into a town with all the corporate powers of other towns in the colony, to be called Westmoreland, attaching it to the county of Litchfield. Thus Connecticut, not at all backward, sought to establish her jurisdiction over this part of Pennsylvania and prepared to enforce her claims. Immigrants from Connecticut poured into the Wyoming Valley, and a census taken in 1774 shows that the town of Westmoreland contained 1,922 inhabitants. Minor estimates the population of the settlement in 1776 at 2,580, but Trumbull estimates it at 5,000. During the Revolution, it received a severe blow by the Wyoming Massacre, from which it rallied appreciably within a few years. By 1786, the tide of immigration from New England had again set in strongly and soon peopled the region on both sides of the Susquehanna, from Wilkes-Barre to the New York line. In 1790, the Connecticut settlers were scattered along the Susquehanna and its branches for a distance of 100 miles, and probably numbered at least 6,000 people. A small number of the immigrants to Westmoreland were located on the Lackawaxen in present Wayne County, in what was known as the Lackawa Settlement. This settlement, though a long way from the Wyoming Valley, was not merely within the territorial limits of Westmoreland, but was united to it in jurisdiction and took part in the government by attending the elections at Wilkes-Barre. The Connecticut people in the Wyoming Valley were an isolated group who led a life of their own and took no part in the general affairs of the province of Pennsylvania. They drew their inspiration from Puritan New England, cherishing the political, religious, and educational traditions of Connecticut, and possessing no sympathy for Pennsylvania life and institutions. With true Yankee tenacity, they persisted in holding on to their shadowy claim to Pennsylvania territory, and when this claim was disallowed by the Trenton Decree, they held out obstinately for some years, but finally submitted to what they could not avoid. Nevertheless, as a result of their activities, a considerable element of energetic, intelligent, and moral people of English stock was added to the population of Pennsylvania, and this group formed the majority of the pioneer settlers of the northern tier of counties of the Keystone State.